Okay, so in the last lesson, we have created a very simple model class that's going to represent an invoice. And once again, it's very simple. It has an amount, a flag of whether or not it's paid, and then ultimately the ability to pay that invoice. So now what we want to do is create a very simple UI that we can then present to the user so they can ultimately see the information that has to do with that invoice. Now, this is where you have a couple options. You can absolutely come in and start to use the toolbox here. We could pin this in and then we could start grabbing all of our common controls, and we could say, oh, maybe I want to start with a text block and I want to stick that on here. And as you can see, as soon as I drag something on here, we then get the XAML on the right hand side. We can continue to do that. Now, the reason why I don't like to go this route is because in my mind it makes you do more work. So if I were to drag this text block out on the design surface, well, that's obviously awfully small, and I'm going to want to change that. So if I want to change that, well, I could come in here and I could click on this little text block guy, and then I could try to get into him somehow. And it's definitely kind of difficult to select these things once you get in here. But then if I can come in and maybe start to edit some of these things, I can view source, or maybe I could just come over here into properties. Well, I could come into properties and see if I could select this guy. Yeah, I got the text block, and then I could try to find the size. So I think it's under text, and I could maybe change this to say 25. And then that'll work, and but I feel like it's too much bouncing back and forth between windows and dragging and dropping and trying to find properties. So that's the reason why I typically like to stick with working with the XAML. So I like to get rid of all of this stuff and just work on the design surface and the XAML editor here on the right, just because I feel it's easier for me to start to lay things out and tweak things and then get immediate feedback as to what it looks like on the design surface. So let's go ahead and get rid of this text block. So the way that I'm envisioning this is that we're going to have a few UI elements on this screen. So I want to start with a simple text block at the top that's going to say something like invoice. So here's how we're going to start this out. We're going to start when we know we're going to have multiple elements on this page, on this particular UI screen. So we're going to need to organize that in some fashion. So I'm simply just going to create a stack panel just because that's a very easy way to do it, and it gives you some very nice spacing and formatting by default. Now, do remember that I'm not really pretending to be a designer here, nor do I really have the aesthetic chops to do that. I'm merely trying to show you how to create a UI just by typing in a very few simple XML elements and attributes to kind of get things wired up. And then you can obviously tweak and do all sorts of changes to this later on. So the first thing I want to show up within my stack panel is a text block. So this is kind of the equivalent of a label if you're ever used to using labels in other types of UI development. Now, as you saw before, by default, it's pretty small, so you're not going to be able to see it very well. So the first thing I want to do is I want to change its font size, and let's make it a little bit bigger. Let's say make it 25, and then let's give it the value of invoice. So as you can see, I see it now on there a little bit. It's pretty high up close to the top. Maybe I want to push that out a little bit, so maybe I want to give it a little bit of a margin on the top. So we'll say 0 on the left and maybe 15 on the top, and then 0 everywhere else, just to space it a little bit from the top. And I really don't like invoice over here. I'd like to kind of center it on the screen. So then in order to do that, I just need to set some text alignment, and I want to set this to center. So there we go. Now we've got a nice little header to our screen here that says invoice. So we have our little text block. So that's pretty nice. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to create the equivalent of a label and maybe a text box that allows maybe some editing or something like that to be able to go in and type in that box or see the ability to type that anywhere, but I'd like to see them horizontally laid out. Well, if I just continue to add things in here, so let's say I add another text block and we say the font size is still 25 and we give it a value of amount. Well, that's nice, but it's going to continue to lay these things out vertically, but I want a text block and a text box maybe horizontal now. I don't want to continue doing that, so how would I do something like that? Well, I can continue to use this concept of a stack panel and merely embed another one in here. So I can create another stack panel, but this time, by default, this first guy here is going to choose an orientation of vertical. That's the default. So I can override that here, and I can say I want the orientation now to be horizontal. So everything that I stick within this stack panel is going to be horizontally aligned in this stack panel. So I want to put my text block in here so it looks like it's still the same. But now if I were to come in here and create a text box, and we can go through and do the same thing. We'll make a font size of 25, and you can see we start to see that here, but we're not getting, this alignment's kind of messy here a little bit, and this text block is really butted up against that amount text block. So let's adjust that a little bit. So the first thing we'll want to do is we'll want to change our text alignment on our text block to be centered, and then we're also going to want to make the vertical alignment equal to center, so that should center that guy, so that looks a little bit better. And now I want to give my text box a little bit of space. It's a little too close there, so I'm going to add a little bit of margin here. So I'll say my margin on the left is going to say be 20, and then we'll make 0 everywhere else. So now we've spaced it out a little bit, so that's kind of nice. And then we want to give this some width. We want this text box to kind of take up some of this space here and not just be this tiny little box here. So then we'll specify some width on this guy, and we'll say, what does 200 look like? 200 looks pretty good. So I think that's pretty nice to get us going. But then these guys here, they're pretty close up to this invoice. I want to space that out a little bit, and that is because of this stack panel coming up right underneath that particular text block. So all I would really need to do is come into my text panel. Then I can specify some more margin here, and on the left is 0 is fine, but maybe give it 25 on the top and see how that looks. Oh, that's a little bit better. I'm a little bit more spaced out now. It's starting to look a little bit nicer. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to have something similar to this layout here, but I want it underneath, and I want it to specify whether or not this invoice has actually been paid or not. So let's go ahead and start to do the same thing. So I'm going to mirror this same functionality with this nested stack panel here. I'm merely going to copy this, and I'll paste it down below. Everything should be just about the same, with the exception that this amount here is now going to be is paid. And then maybe instead of this being a text box, maybe we'll change this to a text block. And this is merely going to be a value of, at least initially, it's probably going to be false, because as we saw before, when we create a new instance of an invoice, by default, it has not been paid yet. So that value is going to be false. So we'll put that in there just to visually see that. And then, of course, you could change the color of some of these things, where you could specify the foreground is going to be, maybe equal to some color, something. We can say, I don't know, maybe red, just to have it stand out a little bit. So now we have that, and now we want to have one more piece of functionality on this screen, and that's going to be a button. And that button is going to allow us to actually pay this particular invoice, which is ultimately going to have some functionality on the screen. So maybe once we hit pay, the pay button, maybe this text box will go from editable to uneditable, and this is paid will go from false to true, or something along those lines. So the next thing we want to create is that particular button, and it simply for now is going to say pay. So that's not too bad. Once again, it's a little close to everything else, so we'll go ahead and give this guy a little bit of margin as well, and we'll specify it as, well, we'll move it a little bit over into the middle, so we'll say 75, 25, 0, and 0. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, that's not too bad. Once again, I'm not a designer, but just to kind of get through the process of seeing how this works. So in my mind, it's very easy to begin to come up with some basic designs for your UIs just by going in here and throwing a little bit of XAML on the screen. Now, when you first start to work with it, it will be a little intimidating, but the best thing that you could possibly do is merely play with it. And the more you play with it, the easier it will get, and the more comfortable you will get in working with it. So here's the UI that we're going to present to the user that's ultimately going to give this invoice information to the consumer or to the customer to let them either enter in or modify the amount of the invoice, and then see whether or not it's paid, and then ultimately pay it if that's what they need to do. So the next thing we want to do, now that we have our model and our view, is we want to jump over into the world of the view model and kind of discuss why we use a view model and what we do in order to actually create one.